what I'm going to do today is to go as far away from the 17th and the 18th centuries as is possible to go, and that is to come right up to the present day. So there's my title, Writing the History of Evangelicalism in Contemporary Wales, by which I mean 1990 right up to this year. So whether that's history or not, you can judge in a moment. But just to give you a little bit of context, because obviously I'm by training an 18th century historian first of all. So why this, and why have I gone in this direction? So what this is part of this book. Okay, I'm about to submit this book to the University of Wales Press. It's practically written, and I know that that's a phrase that can cover a multitude of sins, but it's more or less written, and that is Evangelicalism in Modern Wales, a History, from 1945 to the present. Okay, and what I've not done, so don't get me wrong in a sense, it's not a blow-by-blow account of every aspect of evangelicalism in the period, but it is meant to be a thematic study. So I've picked a series of 5-6 themes there, and then there are individual case studies really that go alongside each one to illustrate the different ways in which evangelicalism has developed in Wales in the modern post-war period. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically an account of the last chapter. Okay, so the last chapter is retrenchment, non-denominational evangelicals in the new millennium is sort of what my case study is. So let me give you a little bit of context on that and start here. 2005, a group of 20 adults, 15 children, joined together with the aim of engaging in what they call pioneer mission in, of all places, Merthyr Tydfil, operating under the umbrella of Sovereign Grace Ministries, a US-based church planting network that characterized itself as both reformed and charismatic. Hope Church, you can see there, took over a disused Calvinistic Methodist chapel in 2011 with the aim of forming what they called a new gospel community. Conscious, they say, that people would need to undertake a cross-cultural missions trip to our church building to hear about the gospel of the kingdom, the new fellowship wanted to strip away or change and reform anything secondary, culture things, preference things, or cherished traditions, and to establish a church that was outward looking and, as they say, as involved as possible in our community. What this meant in practice was serving the purposes of God's mission as households, extended families of faith, where the life and fruit of the gospel is put on public display as friends and neighbours are gathered in. It was a vision underpinned by a strong emphasis on the ministry of the Holy Spirit, the regular use of charismatic gifts, and an expectation that worshippers would enjoy what they called an experiential encounter with God. This was a model that resonated with some of the features of the broader Welsh evangelical tradition, but in others it marked a radical departure from what had once been the norm. In a wider context where churches were either struggling to adapt to their cultural and social context or experiencing rapid decline and closure, Hope Church, by contrast, enjoyed a measure of success. After, and I quote, some wonderful and surprising conversions in the early days, the church had gone on to see, and again I'm quoting, disciples making disciples who were going on to make disciples. New life, it seemed, was being breathed back into the dying embers of Welsh nonconformity. Now, church growth, obviously, in late 20th, early 21st century Wales has been and is a rare commodity. Obviously, Wales has a rich cultural heritage, but it's probably fair to say, true to say, that organised religion has been in faster decline in Wales than possibly any other part of the UK. Paul Chambers has argued that the narrative of decline, though, has tended to mark a more complex picture. The narrative of decline, Chambers argues, has marked a much more complex picture, in which decline, religious decline, has not always been experienced in a uniform way, and alongside it has occurred not just the shrinking of the religious establishment, the shrinking of Wales's religious communities, but also the fragmentation of the religious landscape as well. So as a way to look into these processes in both the recent past and contemporary Wales, this paper examines the fortunes of a group of independent evangelical churches in Wales between 1990 and the present, and it will really be about the present. These churches were loosely clustered around the evangelical movement of Wales. Founded by this man, Elwyn Davies, in 1948, the EMW, Evangelical Movement of Wales, was initially designed to be a parachurch body, with the idea that through conferences, youth camps, ministers' fraternals, book publishing, magazine publishing, through all of those means, evangelicals who were scattered across the Welsh denominational spectrum would be brought together in these extra local church activities. However, by the late 60s, the EMW had narrowed its focus and had evolved to become an association of churches that had seceded from those same denominations on account of their supposed theological liberalism and the gathering ecumenical pace. Now, how do I want to do that? Well, the way I want to approach this community of churches is through a series of 67 church histories, church profiles that were published in the Evangelical Magazine of Wales, or as you see there, it became the Evangelical Magazine. The of Wales bit was dropped from the title. I think it was 2002. So these are fairly recent copies. So the magazine, the official mouthpiece in effect of the evangelical movement, has appeared bi-monthly since 1955. So 6 issues a year since 1955. The church profiles, the church histories bit, feature first appeared in a regular slot in April 1990. So what I've got, what my source base then are these 67 potted church histories. Okay, each one, just to give you a sense of what they look like. Okay, there's a typical example. Excuse the replication. They're bound in a volume and I've caught the edges in the binding. So most of these profiles, kind of potted church histories, are of that kind of length. A double-page spread in the magazine, complete with photographs, usually of the church in the past, maybe the church in the present as well. And across then the 67 articles that I've collected, 60 different congregations were profiled. 7 churches obviously appearing more than once. Of those features, 45 churches were in South Wales, 14 in the north. The churches profiled displayed considerable ecclesiological variation. Most had their origins in secession, and of these, the majority had at one point been part of the Presbyterian Church of Wales, Calvinistic Methodists. 27 of the churches that make up the sample simply call themselves, in their new incarnation, evangelical churches. A few prefixed that term with independent evangelical, or bookended it with Baptist. So Ebenezer, well, that's Ebenezer Evangelical Church. There is an Ebenezer Baptist Church as well. There were 14 former Baptist Union churches, most of these maintaining the Baptist description in their titles. Only one church maintained the title Presbyterian, and there was just one that called itself Congregational. Other churches, betraying their origins as Brethren Assemblies or Independent Mission Halls, adopted titles like Free Church or Mission Church. And there were congregations of more recent vintage, ones that did not have their roots in one of the older denominations, and these tended to be more innovative in their choice of name. Some simply called themselves church, with a prefix to indicate their location. Others called themselves community church or Christian centre, something that reflected some underlying shifts in their character. So while all the churches were consciously evangelical, most had their roots in secession from the older denominations. There was actually, having said that, considerably more diversity in their ecclesiastical preferences and spiritual character than might be assumed. So what are the sources? What do these church profiles tell us about how this group of evangelical congregations have fared during the last 30 odd years? Many of the independent evangelical churches then that had come into existence during the secession crisis of the 60s and 70s, when many of these churches left their denominations, many of the churches were born in fairly traumatic circumstances. In many cases, they'd only been able to assert their independence following a bitter struggle. Sometimes it's seen church members, a long battle over the ownership of a church building, church members camping out in churches as they sought to assert ownership of their properties. In other circumstances, the decision to secede could result in the painful abandonment of old, cherished loyalties, loss of friends, financial hardship, as ministers were often forced to sacrifice the security of a denominational salary, pension, or manse. Having said that, despite these inauspicious beginnings, or possibly even because of them, some of the churches that clustered around the EMW from the late 1960s onwards experienced a measure of early growth. Some examples. A small mission hall in Bridgend, first established in 1914, had dwindled to just 4 elderly members by the early 70s. The arrival of Elwyn Davis as the General Secretary of the EMW and his family tripled the membership overnight. And in the years that followed, as Bridgend itself expanded, with Sony factory, Ford factory and all of that, so the congregation grew. So that by 1990, there were 70 members, a regular morning congregation of 130 in a brand new purpose-built building. Noddfa Evangelical Church in Pontedilais started among a small group of Christians who had become dissatisfied with the liberalism of their denominational churches and began meeting in one another's homes before eventually taking over an old Assemblies of God building that had closed its doors in 1980. Growth was slow at first, but with the help of a larger evangelical church in neighbouring Swansea, solid foundations were laid, leading to the call of a full-time minister in 1990, by which time the church had grown to 30 members. In North Wales, Deeside Evangelical Church started life with just 16 members following the minister's resignation from the Presbyterian Church in Wales in 1975. By 1990, the number of members had risen to 75. None could compare to this church. The Heath Evangelical Church in Cardiff seceded from the Presbyterian Church of Wales in 1971 with a membership of just over 600. The church experienced a significant season of growth under the ministry of Vernon Hyam, peaking at 906 members in 1986. For a time, in the 70s and 80s, some of the churches that aligned themselves with the EMW did not share in the inexorable decline typical of Welsh nonconformity more widely. Now, the reasons for this growth were numerous, though it often reflected local circumstances. As might be expected from church profiles penned primarily by ministers, many highlighted preaching as the chief reason for the success of their church. Zion Baptist Church in Mardy was typical in affirming its belief, and I quote, in the major role which a consistent, expository, evangelistic preaching ministry plays in changing lives. While the principal concern of the leaders of Flint Evangelical Church was, and I quote, God-honouring, biblically based preaching and teaching of the Word of God. The quality of preaching in some churches was enough to attract listeners from a wider hinterland. At Hebron Evangelical Baptist Church in Dowlais, the ministry of Ceri Jones drew many individuals and families of like mind and spirit theologically, he said in his church history. By 1987, the ministry of the church had trebled. Yet this could also present problems. Writing about the early days of Noddfa Evangelical Church in Pontarddulais, the minister complained that some Christians who had moved into the area had chosen not to join the church, preferring to travel to larger churches in neighbouring towns and cities. He wistfully wrote, "A ban on the use of motor cars on Sundays would have helped. It's not an easy matter to join a pioneering church with no pastor, no Sunday school, and no youth work." Other churches pointed to varied evangelistic endeavours as the reason for their success. St Mellon's Baptist Church in Cardiff, a church that could trace its origins to 1794, received an enormous boost and a ready-made mission field with the building of a large housing estate on its doorstep. By the early 90s, there were over 100 in attendance on a Sunday morning. Similarly, on another large housing estate in a different part of Cardiff, around 50 men and women attended to hear a weekly gospel message at Emmanuel Evangelical Baptist Church in Gabalva in 1995. Few, though, were as innovative as Llandudno Evangelical Independent Evangelical Church, which experimented with coffee mornings for the elderly, services in residential homes, open-air preaching, a bookstall at the town's May Day bank holiday, Victorian extravaganza, a stall at the Donkey Derby and Fun Day every July, outreach at the Eglwys Bach Horse Show, and the Honey Fair at neighbouring Conway. Its minister, quite impressive really, isn't it? Its minister, Irfon Parry, was the only EMW minister to have seceded from the church in Wales, and the unusual scope of the evangelistic strategy of his congregation perhaps reflected his own roots in Anglican parish ministry. Yet church growth was not experienced across all the churches profiled, and an increasing note of despondency began to appear in some of the profiles around the start of the new millennium. Some smaller churches struggled to make an impact. At Cwm Afon in the Afon Valley, by the end of the 1970s, the Ynys Afon mission had dwindled to just 2 members. And although help was forthcoming from neighbouring churches and a new pastor was called in the early 1990s, there was still only a dozen members. At Rutherland, a fellowship established with just 4 members in 1985, there were encouragements, and I quote, and heartaches, but little growth, though there seemed to be some acceptance that this was the price to be paid if modern and biblical trends are not adopted. Occasionally, there was a hint of wistful reflection. The Welsh Language Evangelical Church in Cardiff, the author of its profile, bemoaned the fact that the heyday of Welsh Christianity is long gone. Indeed, if some are to be believed, the day of its demise is close to hand. By the early 21st century, congregational growth had become rare, and an air of stagnation had begun to settle over many of the churches. Despite this, there were some within these EMW churches who believed that their fortunes could be quickly restored. For many, this entailed a dogged faithfulness to the Reformed Calvinistic faith and an expository preaching ministry. Many had been deeply influenced by the Reformed renewal of the middle decades of the 20th century. At Ebenezer Baptist Church in Swansea, many testified to a time of spiritual discovery as the Reformed preaching led them to discover a rich spiritual heritage through publishing houses like the Banner of Truth Trust. Other churches had been founded as explicitly Calvinistic congregations. Ebenezer Evangelical Church in Neath, we saw the article there, claimed to, and I quote, stand upon the Reformed tradition, while at Llandudno, we've already referred to, the church prided itself on preaching that is Protestant, the only church to reuse that term, and Reformed in its theology. More common, though, was a desire to maintain an expository preaching ministry. A greater number of churches singled this out as their raison d'etre. Newtown Evangelical Church in Mid Wales, established in 1979, when several families felt the need for a conservative evangelical church with an expository Bible ministry. While, and one of my home churches, Dartford Place Baptist Church in Aberystwyth, and I quote, one thing the pulpit and the pew were agreed on is that the word of God should be preached to them consecutively and relevantly week after week, and that each part of the Bible should be preached to a congregation during its lifetime. Quite a challenge. Now, it was in this area, more than any other, that the influence of this man was most pronounced. This is Dr. Martin Lloyd Jones. Lloyd Jones had been a minister in Port Talbot, church where I was born and raised, not when he was there in the 1920s, I hasten to add, before going up to Westminster Chapel in London in 1938, where he was minister for 30 years. And at Westminster Chapel, which is where you see him preaching there, Lloyd Jones had preached 3 expository sermons a week, Friday evening, and in 2 services on a Sunday morning and evening. Usually, these consisted of systematically preaching through biblical books, most famously, decade-long exposition of Paul's letters to the Romans and the Ephesians. These sermon series had begun to be published by the Banner of Truth from the 1970s, so that those who had little experience of hearing Lloyd Jones in person, died in 1981, could experience the effect of his preaching through the printed page. But in addition to that, until his death in 1981, Lloyd Jones was a frequent presence in Wales. And his practice of preaching at the opening of new EMW churches, the induction of new ministers, or at anniversary services meant that Lloyd Jones possessed something approaching episcopal authority in Wales. He was a dominant influence, much revered, emulated, and even sometimes imitated. Few, though, were prepared to own up to this. Apart, that is, from one man, Geoffrey Thomas in Aberystwyth. He admitted to modelling Alfred Place. The ethos of Alfred Place, he said, upon Westminster Chapel. What this meant in practice was that many EMW churches were dominated by their pulpits, and that the role of the preacher overshadowed everything. The sermon became the be-all and end-all, crowding out other means of spiritual nurture. As a result, congregations could become passive connoisseurs of preaching and preachers. Some thought, for example, that small home group style meetings, characteristic of charismatic renewal, created, and I quote, a small group mentality, wherein all have the opportunity to talk about themselves and how they are personally feeling. If you're hooked on the small group approach, this man said, you'll find it very difficult to assimilate into normal Bible-based Sunday services. It was a startling claim, really, especially when many of these ministers simultaneously looked to the Methodist revival as the golden age of Welsh evangelicalism, a movement built on small group societies meeting all over Wales. So the culture of many of these churches, and perhaps owing to him to some extent, was one that reinforced a sometimes authoritarian clericalism. Now, the other area in which Lloyd Jones's influence could be discerned was on the matter of revival. Given the preoccupation with preaching and preachers, this was often expressed as a desire for the weekly preaching to be accompanied with, and I quote, the Holy Ghost sent down from heaven. Some churches hoped that secession from liberal denominations might actually be the first step towards revival, the preliminary reformation needed to pave the way for greater success and influence. At Margam Road Evangelical Church in Port Talbot, its minister spoke slightly incongruously about how his church had actually returned to its Calvinistic Methodist roots by leaving the Presbyterian Church of Wales, and that they now looked forward to the blessing of God so abundantly known by our fathers in the faith. Others felt that in this age of indifference and growing antagonism towards the Christian faith, the need for our God to be with us powerfully and for the Holy Spirit to be poured out had become all the more pressing. Yet, as the 21st century dawned with little sign of a new religious awakening, there was palpable weariness with talk of revival. At Welshpool Independent Baptist Church, despite, and I quote, "our heart's desire to see God move by his Spirit and many to be saved," there was an admission that this is not what's happening these days. Others criticised the longing for revival as regressive, as something that encouraged a kind of spiritual apathy, diverting churches from meeting head-on the evangelistic challenges of the day. "Growth and flourishing will not be secured," wrote David Ollerton, "by looking back to better days, but by giving more attention to the future." And so talk of revival all but disappeared from the profiles printed in the EMW magazine in the new millennium. It was a trend perhaps evident across the wider evangelical world too, as the long-expected new revival retreated ever further beyond the horizon, so the language of revival was used more sparingly or even dropped altogether. In the early years of the new millennium, there was a growing sense that the EMW churches were preserving an increasingly archaic religious culture. Voices calling for an overhaul became increasingly strident, and a measure of polarization occurred between those churches that stuck to more traditional ways, and those that responded to some of the radical changes in worship and church culture that occurred in the wake of the charismatic renewal. The first inkling of what was to come occurred in 1992 when Peter Jeffrey disparaged churches for choosing, and I quote, "to speak to God in 17th century language and persisting with the use of the authorized version of the Bible." The same issues were aired in a special issue of the Evangelical magazine a few years later, with contributors putting forward various standpoints. Typically pugilistic fashion, Graham Harrison argued that changes in the style and language of worship were more often than not the thin end of a wedge that led to theological drift and a dilution of evangelical distinctives. The issue provoked, as you might imagine, a bumper mailbag. One correspondent lamented that some presented the gospel in a way that made it appear as a throwback to a generation long gone, by an evangelical church in Wales that is, by and large, hopelessly out of touch with the world around it. While another, in sharp contrast, feared that the term evangelical might be beginning to mean in Wales, wait for it, what I fear it has come to mean in England. Coming to terms with the weak cultural values and standards which are associated with teenage music and free forms of church worship. The worship wars had broken out among the EMW churches. In the years that followed, the prominence given to the subject of worship only increased. Now, since the 1970s, the late 1970s, EMW churches had almost uniformly adopted the same style of worship, universally using the green hymn book there, Christian Hymns, published in 1977. And that hymn book had garnered fairly wide praise and acceptance in many evangelical churches in Wales and beyond as well. 2004, and apologies for the white book on a white background, a new edition of Christian Hymns was published that included some light modernization of language and a selection of, wait for it, contemporary songs. it caused consternation. Neil Pfeiffer, the minister at Penniel Green Congregational Church in Llansamlet near Swansea, lamented that the new hymn book embraced new style worship with its weakened theology and tunes in the charismatic idiom. It was a development, he confessed, that had been a deep disappointment to me and to many people, and that has made us fearful for the future of evangelicalism in Wales and the United Kingdom. Now, this was a fairly extreme and minority view, but it did precipitate the withdrawal of some churches and some people from EMW churches to found their own new churches, like this one, Swansea Evangelical Reformed Church, meeting in, goodness knows what that building used to be, but meeting in that garage come whatever, somewhere in Swansea. So some churches withdrew from the life of the EMW, established new churches, and aligned themselves with alternative church networks dedicated to defending traditional forms of worship, and especially the exclusive use of the authorized version of the Bible. And while the new hymn book then was widely adopted in EMW circles, a greater diversity of approaches to worship became the norm. As in other corners of the evangelical world, the revolution in worship practices initiated by the charismatic movement cut a wide swathe through the EMW churches, dividing congregations and leaving considerable ill-feeling and fragmentation in their wake. If a measure of diversification in worship then came to characterize these churches in the early 21st century, the legacy of secession also cast a long shadow. Standing against the prevailing liberalism of the denominations as they saw it, the need to fight for and defend their new position left many churches embattled and in a defensive posture. Some congregations struggled to escape this legacy. Their ability to thrive was hampered. In reality, once secession had occurred, it became much easier to split and secede again. Now, for the historian, approaching this issue is fraught with difficulty. Churches tend, understandably, to be reluctant to talk about the tensions that existed within congregations, still less the painful experience of division. And many of the new churches that emerged following a split from another congregation, similarly, are keen to cast their origins in a more positive light and often omit a full and honest account of the circumstances of their birth. So references to church splits can be oblique, tempered by the desire not to cast aspersions or inflame tensions further. Nonetheless, some examples. Writing about Capel Evangelical Church at Penrhyn Deudraeth in North Wales, Derek Adams hinted that the recent history of the church had not always been free from pain, and that there had been much tension and resulting division, though what those divisions concerned was not spelled out in any detail. To come right up close to home, the story of Lampeter Evangelical Church has been something of a roller coaster, with the church losing its pastor and a large portion of its congregation in the late 1980s, leaving just 3 remaining members. Again, the reasons for this were not given, but the author was in little doubt that the trials the church experienced, and I quote, can be counted as the devil's attacks on God's people. Most positively, there were also occasions when damaging splits could be healed and harmony restored. Ebenezer Baptist Church in Swansea. I think I've got a picture. There it is. Ebenezer Baptist Church in Swansea, just adjacent to the station, High Street in Swansea, had grown significantly under the ministry of Leighton James in the late 70s and 80s, with its imposing city centre building accommodating a large and thriving congregation of professionals and students, 400 to 500 people on a Sunday morning. I quote from the history. An issue arose in the church, that's how it's referred to, concerning James's moral integrity. And this led to a division, resulting in a large section of the congregation forming a new church elsewhere in the city in 1988. 6 years later, following James's eventual resignation from the original church, the two churches reunited, though the congregation of the newly reconstituted church was a fraction of what it had once been. But of all the divisions that took place, the most documented, the most documented was that which took place at the Heath Evangelical Church in Cardiff in 1985, resulting in the founding of Highfields Church in another part of the city. Now, from the perspective of Heath, little detail of the divisions was divulged beyond a reference to tensions within the church committee and the minister's frequent need to be the final arbiter when difficult decisions had to be taken. Seems to be entirely reasonable, but there we are. Yet the loss of 100 members, even in a church the size of Heath, could not have been anything other than traumatic. And an account of these divisions has recently been published in a commemorative history, 35 years after its founding, of the Highfields Church. Peter Baker, who was minister in Highfields for a while, highlighted the autocratic leadership of Vernon Hyam at Heath as a major factor in the division, insisting, and I quote, that the founding members of the Heath had been determined to do things very differently. They had not left Egypt, Peter Baker said, for another pharaoh. But this masked other, more deep-seated differences. The founder members of Highfields, Baker claimed, were actually a bunch of people capable of independent thinking, as if others weren't, familiar with the worldview of Francis Schaeffer, and not just Martin Lloyd-Jones. Integral to their mission was a turning aside from much of the cultural inheritance, not just of Heath, but of the wider EMW too. It was no accident that Highfields chose not to affiliate to the EMW, but to the broader evangelical constituency represented by the Evangelical Alliance. According to Baker, Highfields was characterised by a more egalitarian style of leadership. It was also more diverse in its membership, relatively multicultural, and while certainly Welsh, they proclaimed, it wore that cultural heritage lightly, whatever that means. In addition, and here was perhaps the most tangible area of difference, Highfields attempted to modernise. Women occupied more prominent leadership roles in the church, unheard of in EMW churches. Musical instruments were played in worship, and something other than a suit could be worn on a Sunday. Preaching remained important, but apologetics, social involvement were also prioritised. Here was then a very conscious turning away from some of the features that had traditionally characterised the churches associated with the EMW. During the first 2 decades of the 21st century, it was churches that followed the Highfields model that were to experience renewed growth. So a little bit on this. What have I got? 10 minutes on this, and then we'll draw things to a close. So from 2004, the church profiles that featured in the Evangelical magazine change, and they become almost exclusively concerned with recording congregational innovation and growth. 12 of the churches which featured in this period were brand new. 4 of them self-designated community churches. They were joined by a handful of profiles that featured older congregations that had attempted to reinvent themselves with varying degrees of success. And taken together then, this smaller sample reveals that a marked shift had taken place in the character of some of the churches that continue to fall within the EMW's orbit. Now, by the end of the 1990s, as I've already hinted, there were concerns that the EMW churches were struggling to connect with contemporary Welsh society. By the start of the new millennium, these voices had grown louder and more vociferous. The American pastor of Pillar Community Church in Gorsinan was convinced, and I quote, that more people were interested in the gospel than we realised, and that people wanted spirituality without the packing of religion. This led him to seek for the culturally suited approach to the unsaved in Wales. One, he was convinced, required Christians to jettison the religious trappings of church, which, he said, only seemed to disorientate people. The founders of Broadlands Community Church at Lallaston, near Bridgend, stated that they were determined, first of all, to understand where people are at today, that awful phrase, before thinking outside the box, re-examining why we do things the way we do, and developing new approaches to ministry. If only they had developed new approaches to cliches at the same time. These seeker-friendly instincts then were crystallised in a book by David Ceri that I mentioned a moment ago. 2016, he published a book called A New Mission to Wales, a manifesto in effect calling for a radical rethinking of evangelical approaches to mission. In his sights were what he called the traditional patterns of Welsh nonconformity for church and mission, which, far from being an inheritance to be cherished and passed on from generation to generation, had actually become a hindrance and source of irrelevance. His prescription for the future shape of Welsh evangelicalism, was new churches with a new expression of church and mission, orientated to holistic mission as their raison d'etre, and not as merely an activity for their own survival. For some then, this meant the abandonment of much that had been integral to the life of the churches for generations, and the importing of cultural practices that did not always emerge organically from Welsh soil. Pillar Community Church in Gorsinan again. This meant meeting, at first, in of all places, a local branch of Starbucks. Within a few years of its first convening in 2007, the church said that it could boast 100 regular contacts and at least one person coming to faith every month. Once the church began holding more regular services, every effort was taken to strip down some of the non-essential elements of a church service. There were no pews, no long pastoral prayer, no hymn sandwiches, no notices. All these things were replaced with contemporary worship, Bible teaching, and a time of open discussion, all washed down with good coffee. I was tempted to say, keep you awake, but I won't say that. As befitting its connections with Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California, a church planting network with thousands of churches across the world, Pillar Community Church was, they claimed, they boasted, a cross between Starbucks, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the church. What worked in California was going to work in Gorsinan. For others, rethinking church meant re-examining the place given to social action. One of the most striking developments in evangelicalism generally in the second half of the 20th century was the abandonment by many of a suspicion of social concern, born of opposition, of course, to the social gospel in the 1920s and the 1930s. From the 70s, the Lausanne movement urged evangelicals to see their evangelistic responsibilities as encompassing not just the saving of souls, but the redemption of society as well. So an increased priority to issues of social justice, community building, began to be seen in the church profiles. Baglan Community Church in Port Talbot. I'm from Port Talbot, hence all the Port Talbot references, okay? Baglan Community Church near Port Talbot purchased a rundown working men's club and opened a church that was part worshipping community, part community hub. At Broadlands near Bridgend, there was a determination, the church with all the cliches, there was a determination to take the gospel to the people amongst whom we live and work, largely through the organisation of football teams, help for the elderly and the housebound, members serving as local church school governors. At Machynlleth, the local Presbyterian Church of Wales congregation was on the brink of closure before an evangelical group agreed to take over the building. It rebranded themselves as Machynlleth Community Church in 2011, repurposed an old 19th century chapel building for use by all kinds of groups across the town. While growth remains small, not least because Machynlleth, and I quote, is a centre of New Age activity, the visibility of the church in the town was greatly enhanced. Yet the proliferation of community activities did not always translate into substantial growth. At Minster Christian Centre in Cardiff, activities mushroomed after the church was relaunched in 1995, but there was the open admission that there had been no sustained breakthrough. At Mount Pleasant Baptist Church on the Kingsway in Swansea, the arrival of a new minister in 2000, when the church was at a low ebb, led to the cutting back on all activities apart from preaching and the weekly prayer meeting, and a new emphasis on evangelism. Missions led by Anglican clergyman Rico Tice of All Souls Langham Place in London, and regular Christianity Explored courses injected a degree of new life. But the church profile laconically admitted that while it's true that the church has grown, some have left too. There were also one or two instances of churches being revitalised by more traditional means. The arrival of a new minister at Bethesda Baptist Chapel at Narberth in 1995 to a church that had, and I quote, had come to a position of not knowing the gospel rather than opposing it, led to the remarkable turnaround of a church that seemed to be in terminal decline. A few of the older members were converted, and a number of mature Christians moved into the increasingly gentrified town of Narberth. It's one of the top two places in Wales to live, isn't it? Cowbridge and Narberth? I wouldn't. No? But, my wife would quite like to, but that's beside the point. This led then to a new evangelistic impetus. Attempts at door-to-door visitation, bookstall at the local weekly market, leading assemblies at local schools. A commitment to evangelistic preaching on Sundays resulted, and I quote, in an air of expectancy that the Lord will work. Somewhat against the grain then of the other profiles published at the same time, the minister assured readers that God still uses the pastoral ministry, you know, and the churches which had become liberal or doctrinally poor can be turned around. Well, many of the examples of growth that featured were drawn from urban areas. Chris Rees, the minister at Narberth, urged there is a great need in Wales and elsewhere for men, notice, to take a step out into barren areas. God is able to bless wilderness situations. Don't think anybody else calls Narberth a wilderness today. So, while the COVID, I'll draw this to an end, the COVID epidemic, that we would rather forget, was enormously disruptive of the lives of EMW churches. The switch to online services in some instances proved to be an unexpected boon. At Caerwent, there was some trepidation that the progress that had been made in the months before the pandemic would be brought to a shuddering halt. But in reality, the number attending accessing services actually increased, and there had been one conversion. At Park End Church in Cardiff, the pandemic actually led to innovation. And in one of the only references to the importance of Holy Communion in all of the church profiles, the ministers reported on efforts to offer communion on Saturdays to people as they sat in their cars outside the church. It proved to be an opportunity, he wrote, to share with lost, anxious, lonely, sinful, broken, and afraid people that they can call to the Lord and he will save them. They were unique in turning Eucharistic worship into an evangelistic opportunity. In the post-COVID world, there were some inklings that perhaps church growth might even have returned. The independent evangelical church at Newtown in Mid Wales, the congregation proved quick off the mark in opening up again at the end of lockdown in 2021, with the result that its many children's and youth activities were bursting at the seams. It was reported that over 150 children and young people were attending the church's various clubs on a Friday night, and that a number of teenagers had become Christians after attending an additional Wednesday evening youth Bible study. Just north of Bridgend, the pastor at Gateway Church. The pastor of Gateway Church had begun meeting in Tondee Cricket Club in 2021. I didn't realise there was a cricket club in Tondee. So these were meeting in Tondee Cricket Club from 2021. Wrote that prodigals have come home and people who would not have been engaged with church are now regulars with us. The Lord is at work, the minister said, in the areas north of the M4. That profile published just last month, hence the 2023 reference in the title. So what do all these church profiles tell us about evangelical religion in the recent past and in contemporary Wales? Well, while the churches discussed don't represent the whole of the Welsh evangelical constituency, far from it, they do constitute a rich and varied source through which to examine the fortunes of an identifiable group of churches within what some like to call post-Christian Wales. They reveal that while church growth has been relatively rare in late 20th and early 20th century Wales, it has not been entirely absent. Initially, some of those churches that coalesced around the EMW after seceding from various nonconformist denominations in the late 60s, 70s and early 80s, some of those churches experienced a degree of growth, although in many instances this was due to the attraction of Christians from other churches. By the 1990s, this initial growth had largely petered out. Many of the churches profiled in the Evangelical Magazine of Wales struggled to consolidate their position amidst controversies over modes of worship and the ever-present threat of further church splits and secessions. Yet, by the early 21st century, there are perhaps signs of renewed growth, especially among churches that have thought hard about their role within contemporary Welsh society and responded to the challenge to reinvent themselves, if not in terms of their message or their theology, then certainly in terms of their culture, mission and relationship to their local communities. By contrast, those that have remained wedded to traditional ways have found life in 21st century Wales difficult and disorientating. So whilst there had once been considerable hope that leaving the theologically compromised nonconformist denominations shedding that skin would revitalise evangelical witness in Wales, that hope has not been fully realised as of May 2023.